Sometimes the richest person in the room is the one no one notices until it's too late. The Harbor House Steak and Grill overlooked the quiet marina just outside Annapolis, Maryland, where rows of sailboats rocked gently beneath the fading colors of an early autumn sky. The dinner crowd had already filled nearly every table, and the soft clinking of silverware blended with the mellow notes of a jazz piano drifting from hidden speakers. Candlelight reflected across polished windows while waiters moved gracefully between conversations, expensive watches, tailored suits, and carefully rehearsed laughter. Yet tucked into the far corner, beneath a framed black and white photograph of a Navy destroyer cutting through rough Atlantic waters decades ago, sat a man who seemed invisible to everyone except the elderly waitress who smiled every time she refilled his coffee. His name was Ethan Walker. 42 years old. A former United States Navy sailor. A single father. He wore a neatly pressed navy blue button-down shirt that had clearly seen many years of careful washing, faded blue jeans, and boots polished with the kind of patience only someone accustomed to discipline could appreciate. There was nothing remarkable about the way he looked if someone judged him by appearances alone. No expensive watch. No designer jacket. No luxury car keys resting beside his plate. Just calm eyes that carried the quiet weight of years spent keeping promises no one else remembered. Ethan wasn't there to celebrate anything. Every Thursday evening, after dropping his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, at choir practice across town, he treated himself to one steak dinner. It was a promise he had made years earlier to his late wife, Emily, during one of their final conversations together. She had laughed softly, and told him that no matter how difficult life became, he shouldn't forget he was still a person worth taking care of. So every Thursday, without fail, he honored that promise. Not because he loved expensive food, but because keeping promises had become the way he remembered love. He unfolded the cloth napkin carefully across his lap before offering a grateful nod as Mrs. Evelyn, the 70-year-old waitress who had worked there longer than anyone could remember, placed his dinner in front of him. "Medium rare, baked potato, no sour cream," she said warmly. Ethan smiled. "You always remember. Some people make it easy," she replied before quietly walking away to another table. Ethan bowed his head for just a moment. Not long enough for anyone to notice unless they were watching closely. Just enough to whisper gratitude for another ordinary day, another healthy daughter, another chance to keep moving forward. Outside, headlights swept across the restaurant windows as luxury sedans began arriving one after another. Several guests glanced toward the entrance with growing curiosity. Something unusual was happening. Conversation slowed. A maitre d' hurried toward the front doors with an expression that mixed excitement and nervous anticipation. One young server whispered, "Is that really her?" Another leaned around the corner. "It can't be." Phones disappeared beneath tables as people tried to appear discreet, while secretly hoping to witness something worth telling tomorrow morning. Ethan noticed none of it. He was carefully cutting his steak into smaller pieces, setting aside nearly half of it inside a reusable container he always carried in his messenger bag. Lily loved leftover steak sandwiches for school lunches, and somehow they tasted even better the next day. The restaurant doors opened. A cool breeze slipped inside before the room gradually settled into an almost reverent silence. She entered without an entourage, without photographers, without the dramatic confidence people expected from someone whose face regularly appeared on financial magazines across America. Charlotte Bennett paused near the entrance, dressed in a simple ivory coat over an elegant navy dress, her blonde hair resting naturally over one shoulder. To most strangers she looked graceful rather than glamorous. But nearly everyone inside recognized her immediately. Founder and CEO of Bennett Global Ventures. Billionaire. Philanthropist. One of the most influential business leaders in the country. The hostess hurried forward. "Ms. Bennett, your private dining room is ready." Charlotte offered a polite smile before quietly asking, "Is every table full tonight?" The hostess blinked. "Almost." Charlotte slowly looked across the crowded dining room. Business executives laughed loudly over expensive bourbon. Couples posed for photographs before touching their meals. Investors waved eagerly, hoping to catch her attention. Her eyes passed every beautifully decorated table without stopping. Then they reached the quiet corner beneath the old Navy photograph. Ethan never looked up. He simply continued eating dinner with peaceful gratitude, completely unaware that the wealthiest woman in the restaurant had just stopped walking because, for the first time that evening, she had noticed the only person who seemed completely uninterested in being noticed. Charlotte Bennet remained perfectly still for several seconds, her attention resting on the quiet man beneath the old Navy photograph while the rest of the restaurant waited for her next move. The hostess cleared her throat gently. "Miss Bennet, your private room is prepared whenever you are ready." Charlotte smiled politely without taking another step. "Thank you. Give me just a moment." The hostess nodded, although confusion briefly crossed her face. It was unusual enough that Charlotte Bennet had arrived without assistance or security. It was even more unusual that she seemed uninterested in the elegant private dining room reserved exclusively for her. Across the restaurant, Ethan Walker quietly folded the lid over the reusable container holding half of his steak before placing it carefully into his worn leather messenger bag. Lily would smile tomorrow afternoon when she opened her lunchbox at school. He could already imagine her telling her best friend that her father made the best steak sandwiches in Maryland, even though the secret belonged entirely to Harbor House Steak and Grill. The thought brought a faint smile to his face. Small joys had become the strongest foundation of his life. Years earlier, after Emily passed away following a long illness, Ethan had discovered that grief did not disappear all at once. It slowly changed shape. Some days it felt like heavy rain. Other days it became a quiet breeze carrying familiar memories through ordinary moments. He learned not to run from either one. Instead, he built a simple life where every routine mattered. Wake up before sunrise. Prepare Lily's breakfast. Walk her to the school bus whenever his work schedule allowed. Finish a full day repairing boats at the marina. Help with homework. Read one chapter together before bedtime. Repeat. The routine never felt boring. It felt dependable. And dependability was another way of saying love. Ethan reached into his wallet and carefully counted several $20 bills before placing them inside the small leather folder holding the check. Mrs. Evelyn approached again carrying the receipt. "You know," she said with her familiar grandmotherly smile, "I keep telling management they should let me give you the regular customer discount." Ethan chuckled softly. "Then they would lose money. Not enough to matter." She lowered her voice. "You are one of the few people who always asks me how my knees are doing before ordering dinner." Ethan looked at her kindly. "Because I actually want to know." Her eyes warmed. "They are behaving today. That is good news." Before she could answer, another server hurried toward her. "Mrs. Evelyn, they need you near the entrance." She excused herself with a quick smile, leaving Ethan alone once again. Charlotte quietly observed the exchange from across the room. There had been no performance. No exaggerated politeness. No attempt to impress anyone. He treated the elderly waitress exactly the same way he would have treated anyone else. Respect came naturally to him, almost invisibly. She found herself wondering how many people in the room had even noticed. Probably very few. Most had been too busy noticing her. Charlotte had spent more than 20 years walking through rooms where conversations changed the instant she entered. Some people became overly cheerful. Others became nervous. Many immediately began calculating opportunities hidden behind introductions and compliments. She could usually predict every conversation before it happened. Success had brought influence. Influence had attracted attention. Attention had slowly built invisible walls around her life. Genuine moments had become surprisingly rare. That was why she occasionally traveled alone under her own name without announcing her arrival. She wanted to remember what ordinary conversations felt like. Tonight she had expected another predictable evening surrounded by carefully polished business etiquette. Instead she had found a man who had not looked toward the entrance even once. The maitre d' approached Charlotte again. "Would you prefer that we ask another guest to free a table for you?" Charlotte shook her head gently. "Absolutely not." She glanced once more toward Ethan's corner. How long has that gentleman been dining here? The maitre d' followed her gaze. Mr. Walker? Almost every Thursday for several years. Does he always sit there? Whenever the table is available. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. Thank you. At that very moment Ethan noticed a young father near the front of the restaurant trying unsuccessfully to calm a restless little boy no older than 5. The child looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes while his parents apologized repeatedly for the delay in being seated. Ethan quietly reached into his messenger bag, removed a small folded paper sailboat that Lily had made the previous weekend, and walked over without hesitation. Excuse me, he said with a gentle smile. My daughter makes these for children whenever she thinks someone might need a smile. The little boy stared at the paper boat before accepting it with both hands. His face brightened almost instantly. It is a pirate ship, the boy whispered proudly. Ethan smiled. Then I hope it finds a great adventure. He returned to his table without waiting for thanks, never noticing that Charlotte Bennet had witnessed every second of the exchange. For reasons she could not yet explain, something inside her became unexpectedly quiet. In a room filled with wealth, influence, ambition, and carefully rehearsed confidence, the most extraordinary person she had seen all evening was simply a father who carried paper boats in his bag because his little girl believed kindness should always be ready before it was needed. Charlotte Bennet had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions across polished boardroom tables where every smile carried a strategy, and every compliment concealed a calculation. She had learned to recognize ambition within seconds, to separate confidence from arrogance, and to identify sincerity before most people finished introducing themselves. Yet, as she watched Ethan Walker return quietly to his corner table after handing a folded paper sailboat to a stranger's little boy, she realized she could not place him inside any category she had spent decades building. He had not looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. He had not waited for gratitude. He had simply returned to his dinner, as though kindness required no audience. Charlotte slowly exhaled. That was becoming increasingly rare. Around her, several guests had finally gathered enough courage to approach. One gentleman in an expensive charcoal suit stepped forward holding a business card between 2 fingers. Ms. Bennet, it is such an honor to finally meet you. I represent a private investment group that has been hoping for just 5 minutes of your time. Before she could answer, another couple introduced themselves, praising her charitable foundation while subtly mentioning their newest development project. Charlotte listened politely, offering warm smiles that never felt dishonest, yet she recognized the familiar rhythm immediately. Every conversation pointed somewhere. Every sentence carried an expectation. Every compliment quietly reached toward a future favor. She thanked them sincerely before excusing herself. As the small crowd dispersed, her gaze drifted back toward Ethan. He had opened a worn paperback novel while waiting for his check to be processed. The edges of the pages had softened from years of use, and a simple photograph served as his bookmark. From where she stood she could not see the picture clearly, but she noticed the careful way he placed it between the pages before closing the book again. It was the gesture of someone protecting a memory rather than simply marking a chapter. Charlotte found herself smiling without realizing it. The maitre d' returned once more. Ms. Bennet, would you like us to prepare your dinner now? She nodded thoughtfully before asking a question that surprised even herself. If I asked to sit with Mr. Walker, would that make him uncomfortable? The maitre d' blinked. I honestly could not say. Charlotte appreciated the honesty. Then perhaps the better question is whether he enjoys eating alone. The older man considered it carefully. He never seems lonely, if that helps. Those words lingered in her thoughts. There was a meaningful difference between solitude and loneliness, and somehow Ethan appeared to understand it better than most people she had ever met. Across the room Ethan glanced briefly at the framed Navy photograph above his table. The destroyer cutting through rough water reminded him of another evening years earlier when he had stood on the deck of a ship watching the Atlantic disappear beneath a blanket of stars. One of his closest friends had told him that the ocean taught the same lesson every father eventually learned. You cannot control every wave, but you can choose how you guide the people depending on you. Ethan had never forgotten those words. They returned often while raising Lily, especially during difficult days when he questioned whether he was doing enough. He reached into his wallet once again and looked at the small photograph tucked behind his driver's license. Emily stood laughing beneath a maple tree while a 3-year-old Lily reached for falling leaves. The picture had faded slightly over the years, but the memory remained perfectly clear. Ethan smiled softly before sliding the photograph back into its place. He whispered almost silently, "She is doing well. You would be proud of her." Mrs. Evelyn returned carrying his receipt. "Everything all right tonight?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Better than all right. Lily still singing every chance she gets?" "Every single day." Mrs. Evelyn laughed warmly. "Then this world is already a little brighter." Ethan thanked her, left a generous tip despite his modest budget, and slowly stood to gather his belongings. His messenger bag rested comfortably over one shoulder, carrying tomorrow's lunch for Lily, his paperback novel, and a little notebook where he occasionally wrote down thoughts he hoped his daughter might one day enjoy reading. Charlotte watched him prepare to leave, and an unfamiliar feeling settled over her heart. If he walked out that door, this evening would become nothing more than another quiet observation, another unanswered curiosity disappearing into memory. Yet every instinct she trusted told her that walking away now would mean losing an opportunity no amount of wealth could recreate. She had spent years searching for conversations untouched by status, untouched by expectation, untouched by the invisible weight attached to her name. For the first time in a very long while, she believed she had found one. Ethan reached for the back of his chair, completely unaware that only a few steps away, Charlotte Bennet had already made a decision that would quietly change the course of both their lives before the night was over. Ethan adjusted the strap of his worn leather messenger bag and reached for the check folder one final time, making certain he had not forgotten anything before heading across town to pick up Lily from choir practice. He had developed that habit years ago after becoming a father. Wallet, keys, phone, lunch container, book, photograph. Every item had its place because every forgotten detail usually meant making life a little harder for someone else. He slid the chair neatly beneath the table, offered one last appreciative smile toward Mrs. Evelyn, and turned toward the exit. "Mr. Walker." The gentle voice stopped him before he had taken more than 3 steps. Ethan turned politely. Standing a few feet away was the elegant blonde woman who had quietly captured the attention of nearly every guest in the restaurant since she had arrived. He recognized neither her face nor her name. To him, she was simply another customer enjoying dinner on an ordinary Thursday evening. Charlotte smiled with calm sincerity. "I hope I am not interrupting your evening." Ethan returned a respectful smile. "Not at all." She hesitated for only a moment before speaking again. "This may sound unusual, but would you mind joining me for dinner instead of leaving?" Ethan blinked, surprised but not uncomfortable. He glanced around the crowded dining room, then back at her. "I already finished eating." Charlotte laughed softly. "I noticed." The warmth in her voice carried none of the confidence people often used when they expected immediate agreement. Instead, it sounded almost hopeful. "Would you consider having dessert instead?" Ethan looked toward the windows where the evening sky had grown darker over the quiet marina. He checked the time on his watch. There was still nearly 40 minutes before Lily's choir rehearsal ended. Plenty of time. Even so, he answered honestly. "I appreciate the invitation, but I should probably keep my spending under control." Charlotte's smile widened slightly. "Then allow me to clarify. I would like to buy dessert because I have been hoping to ask you something." Ethan tilted his head with quiet curiosity. "Do we know each other?" "No, have we met before?" "Not that I know of." "Then I am afraid I do not understand." Charlotte nodded. "Neither do I completely." That unexpected answer made Ethan smile for the first time since they had spoken. It was not the response he had anticipated. She continued carefully. "I have spent the last 20 minutes watching how you treated everyone around you. The waitress. The little boy. Even the way you pack tomorrow's lunch before thinking about yourself. I realized something. Ethan waited without interrupting. I realized I could probably learn more from one honest conversation with you than another evening discussing financial forecasts. He chuckled quietly. You might be disappointed. I repair boats for a living. Financial forecasts are not exactly my specialty. Charlotte answered with complete sincerity. Character is. The room around them continued humming with conversations, yet for a brief moment everything else seemed strangely distant. Ethan studied her expression. There was no trace of sarcasm. No hidden agenda that he could recognize. Just genuine curiosity. All right, he said finally. One dessert. Charlotte's face brightened with visible relief. Thank you. The hostess hurried forward immediately, eager to prepare the private dining room, but Charlotte gently stopped her. No private room tonight. She looked toward Ethan's small corner table beneath the framed navy photograph. May we sit there instead? The hostess looked surprised. Of course. Several nearby guests exchanged puzzled glances as Charlotte carried her own menu across the dining room rather than allowing anyone else to escort her. Ethan politely pulled out the chair opposite his own before taking his seat again. Mrs. Evelyn approached carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. Looks like your Thursday is becoming interesting, she whispered with a knowing smile. Ethan laughed softly. Apparently. Charlotte thanked the waitress before opening the dessert menu. What would you recommend? Mrs. Evelyn answered without hesitation. The homemade apple pie. It has been the favorite here for almost 30 years. Charlotte closed the menu immediately. Then 2 slices of apple pie, please. Mrs. Evelyn smiled and walked away. For a few comfortable seconds neither of them spoke. The silence felt surprisingly natural rather than awkward. Outside, gentle waves rocked against wooden docks while the lights from anchored sailboats shimmered across the dark water like scattered stars. Inside, candlelight reflected softly against polished glasses. Ethan folded his hands on the table. I suppose introductions would be a good place to start. Charlotte nodded. I agree. I am Ethan Walker. He extended his hand across the table. Charlotte accepted it with a firm but graceful handshake. Charlotte Bennett. Ethan smiled politely. It is nice to meet you, Charlotte. There was no flicker of recognition in his eyes. No widened expression. No sudden excitement. He released her hand exactly as he would have greeted anyone else. For perhaps the first time in many years, Charlotte Bennett experienced the rare comfort of introducing herself without watching someone react to the weight of her name, and she found that she liked the sound of it far more when it was spoken by someone who had absolutely no idea who she was. Mrs. Evelyn returned a few minutes later carrying 2 generous slices of warm apple pie, each topped with a scoop of vanilla ice cream slowly melting beneath the gentle glow of the candle between them. The sweet aroma of cinnamon drifted across the table, blending with the rich scent of fresh coffee and the faint trace of salt carried in from the harbor whenever the front door opened. She set the plates down with grandmotherly satisfaction. If this does not make 2 strangers become friends, nothing will. Ethan smiled. You have a lot of confidence in pie. Mrs. Evelyn laughed softly. After 40 years in this restaurant, I have earned it. Charlotte thanked her warmly before watching the waitress disappear into the steady rhythm of the dining room once again. For a brief moment neither of them reached for their dessert. Instead they simply enjoyed the peaceful silence surrounding the table. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt like the kind that appeared naturally between people who had nothing to prove. Ethan finally picked up his fork. So what made you choose this table? Charlotte rested her hands around her coffee cup before answering honestly. Because it was the only place in the room where no one seemed interested in impressing anyone. Ethan glanced around the restaurant before chuckling quietly. That sounds like a compliment I am not sure I deserve. You do. Charlotte smiled gently. You never looked toward the entrance when everyone else did. Ethan shrugged. I suppose I was distracted. By your dinner? By tomorrow's lunch. Charlotte laughed with genuine amusement. The steak? My daughter loves steak sandwiches. Thursday leftovers have become something of a tradition. Charlotte lowered her eyes toward the messenger bag resting beside his chair. So you were packing lunch while everyone else was watching the room. That seemed more important. His answer arrived so naturally that it carried no trace of self-praise. Charlotte noticed that immediately. She had spent years listening to people describe their generosity in carefully polished language. Ethan simply lived his. How old is your daughter? She asked. 9. His expression softened almost instantly. Her name is Lily. She must adore you. Ethan smiled with quiet humility. I hope she always knows she is loved. Everything else can be figured out together. Charlotte stirred her coffee slowly. Children have a way of changing how we measure success. Ethan nodded. They certainly changed mine. What does success look like now? She asked. He thought for a few seconds before answering. If Lily goes to bed feeling safe, if she laughs more days than she cries, if she grows into someone who is kind when nobody is watching, then I have done my job. Charlotte remained silent for a moment. The answer settled gently in her heart because it sounded so completely different from the conversations she usually heard. Boardrooms measured quarterly growth. Investors measured percentages. News headlines measured fortunes. Ethan measured bedtime laughter. And your work? She asked. Mrs. Evelyn mentioned you repair boats. Mostly fishing boats and small sailboats. Do you enjoy it? Very much. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Most people complain about their jobs. Ethan smiled. Every boat belongs to someone with a story. Some are saving for retirement. Some inherited them from parents. Some simply want one peaceful afternoon on the Chesapeake Bay with their families. Keeping those memories afloat feels like worthwhile work. Charlotte found herself studying his face as he spoke. There was no bitterness about opportunities missed. No regret hidden beneath his words. Only quiet appreciation for the life he had built. You make ordinary things sound extraordinary, she said softly. Ethan shook his head. I think ordinary things are extraordinary. We just stop noticing. Outside, a gentle breeze rippled across the marina, causing dozens of sailboat masts to chime softly against one another like distant wind bells. The sound drifted through the windows and settled comfortably around their conversation. Charlotte looked toward the water before speaking again. Do you come here every Thursday because of the view? Ethan followed her gaze. Partly. He smiled at the reflection of the boats dancing across the dark water. My wife loved watching sunsets over the harbor. After she passed away, I kept coming because it reminds me that beautiful things continue even after difficult seasons. Charlotte lowered her eyes. I am sorry. Ethan nodded appreciatively. Thank you. It has been several years now. The sadness changes, but the gratitude stays. Charlotte quietly absorbed those words. Gratitude stays. She repeated the sentence silently as though committing it to memory. It was remarkable how a man she had known for less than 15 minutes had already given her more honest perspective than countless executives had offered over entire careers. Across the restaurant, several guests continued glancing toward their table with growing curiosity, unable to understand why one of the most recognizable women in America seemed completely captivated by an ordinary conversation over apple pie. Neither Charlotte nor Ethan noticed. They were too busy discussing favorite books, childhood memories near the water, Lily's choir rehearsals, and the small traditions that quietly held families together. For the first time in many years, Charlotte realized she had spent nearly half an hour talking with someone who had never once asked what she owned, what she earned, or what she could provide. He simply listened when she spoke, smiled when she laughed, and treated her with the same calm respect he had shown every other person that evening. Somewhere deep inside her, a wall she had spent years unknowingly building began to crack, not because anyone tried to break it down, but because one quiet father had never seen it in the first place. The conversation drifted as naturally as the tide beyond the restaurant windows. They spoke about favorite places along the Chesapeake Bay, childhood summers that smelled of salt air and fresh pine, and the quiet satisfaction of watching a sunrise before the rest of the world had awakened. Charlotte found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, perhaps years. Ethan never interrupted her. He listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions that had nothing to do with business or influence. He seemed genuinely interested in what brought people peace rather than what brought them success. It was a refreshing change from the endless networking dinners that usually filled her calendar. Mrs. Evelyn stopped briefly beside their table to refill their coffee cups. She smiled warmly at Ethan before glancing toward Charlotte. "You picked a good conversation partner." Charlotte smiled back. "I think I did." Mrs. Evelyn nodded knowingly. "Some people leave this place remembering the food. Others remember the company." She quietly walked away, leaving the gentle aroma of fresh coffee hanging between them. Ethan looked toward his watch for a moment. "I still have a little time before I need to pick up Lily." Charlotte noticed the affection in his voice every time he mentioned his daughter. "She sings in a choir?" "She loves music," Ethan replied. "Sometimes I think she wakes up humming before she remembers to open her eyes." Charlotte laughed softly. "That sounds wonderful." "It is," Ethan answered. "The house felt very quiet after my wife passed away. Lily filled it with music again." Charlotte lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "You must be very proud of her." "Every single day." Before she could answer, a sudden ripple of whispers spread through the dining room. At a nearby table, 3 sharply dressed executives had finally stopped pretending not to watch Charlotte. One of them, Richard Collins, recognized her immediately. As the founder of a regional investment firm, he had spent years hoping for an opportunity to introduce himself to the woman whose decisions regularly shaped entire industries. He stood, adjusted his tailored jacket, and walked confidently toward their table with 2 colleagues following behind him. "Ms. Bennett," Richard said with an enthusiastic smile. "What an unexpected pleasure! I cannot believe we are fortunate enough to see you here this evening." Charlotte offered a polite but restrained smile. "Good evening." Richard glanced briefly toward Ethan before returning his attention to Charlotte. "I was hoping to speak with you about a renewable energy proposal my partners have been developing." Charlotte answered kindly. "I appreciate that, but tonight I am enjoying a private conversation." Richard nodded, although disappointment flashed across his face. Then his eyes drifted back toward Ethan. His confident smile changed almost imperceptibly. "I apologize," he said. "I assumed you were waiting for someone more appropriate." Ethan remained completely calm. "She was." Richard forced a laugh. "Of course." One of the younger executives standing beside him leaned closer and whispered loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Looks like somebody had the luckiest dinner reservation in Maryland." A few quiet chuckles floated through the surrounding tables. Another man added with a grin, "I guess sitting in the right corner can change your life." Charlotte immediately recognized the tone. She had heard it many times before. People assuming that any ordinary man speaking with a successful woman must have some hidden ambition. Ethan simply rested his coffee cup on the table without showing the slightest irritation. Richard smiled again, although this time his friendliness carried an unmistakable edge. "Forgive my curiosity, sir. Are you in finance?" Ethan shook his head. "No law? No technology?" Ethan smiled gently. "I repair boats." For a brief second silence settled over the group before one executive let out a restrained laugh. "Well," he said, "that certainly explains the relaxed schedule." Another added, "You never know who you might meet when business is slow." Several nearby diners exchanged amused glances. The comments were subtle enough to remain polite on the surface, yet their meaning was unmistakable. They assumed Ethan had somehow stumbled into extraordinary company by accident, and would naturally try to benefit from it. Charlotte watched Ethan carefully, expecting at least a flicker of embarrassment. Instead, he simply nodded with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. "Every job matters," he replied quietly. "Mine just happens to float." Richard blinked, uncertain how to respond. Ethan's answer contained neither defensiveness nor pride. It was simply true. Charlotte noticed something remarkable happen around the table. The executives had arrived expecting to impress her. Instead, they found themselves unable to unsettle the quiet man sitting across from her. His confidence did not come from wealth, reputation, or status. It came from knowing exactly who he was. Richard cleared his throat. "Well, we will not interrupt your evening any longer." Charlotte nodded politely. "Thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of yours." As the three men returned to their table, one of them looked back over his shoulder with obvious confusion. He still could not understand why Charlotte Bennet seemed far more interested in sharing apple pie with a humble boat mechanic than discussing million-dollar investments with people who had spent their entire careers trying to earn 5 minutes of her attention. Ethan, however, had already returned to his conversation as though nothing unusual had happened at all, and somehow that quiet dignity made an even deeper impression on Charlotte than anything he had said that evening. The restaurant gradually returned to its familiar rhythm after the executives walked away, but something subtle had changed beneath the quiet surface. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked gently against polished tables, and the jazz piano continued drifting through the room with the same relaxed melody. Yet every so often another curious glance found its way toward the small corner beneath the Old Navy photograph. Charlotte noticed them all. Ethan seemed to notice none of them. He took another sip of coffee before smiling almost apologetically. "I hope that did not make your evening uncomfortable." Charlotte looked at him with genuine surprise. "You are worried about my evening?" "Of course." He shrugged lightly. "People can become awkward when they misunderstand a situation." Charlotte laughed softly. "You are the one they were quietly judging." Ethan stirred his coffee without the slightest sign of resentment. "That usually says more about them than it does about me." She studied his calm expression for several seconds. "Does it never bother you?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "It used to." He looked toward the marina where small lights shimmered across the dark water beyond the windows. "When I was younger, I believed every misunderstanding needed to be corrected. Every unfair opinion deserved an explanation. Then life taught me something different." Charlotte leaned forward slightly. "What was that?" "Most people eventually reveal whether they are interested in the truth, or only in confirming what they already believe." Charlotte remained silent. Ethan continued gently. "If someone genuinely wants to know me, I am happy to talk. If they have already decided who I am before we meet, no speech I give will change their mind." The words settled quietly between them. Charlotte found herself remembering countless interviews, public appearances, and shareholder meetings where strangers confidently described her life without ever asking a single question. She had spent years defending decisions that people had already judged before understanding them. "That sounds lonely," she admitted softly. Ethan smiled. "Sometimes." He looked down at the folded paper napkin resting beside his plate. "But peace is usually quieter than winning an argument." Charlotte repeated the sentence silently inside her thoughts. "Peace is usually quieter than winning an argument." It was another lesson she wished someone had taught her years earlier. Mrs. Evelyn passed nearby carrying a tray of fresh bread. She noticed their thoughtful expressions and smiled knowingly without interrupting. Outside, the harbor breeze gently moved the American flag mounted near the entrance, its reflection dancing across the dark water in long waves of red, white, and blue. Ethan glanced at his watch again before slipping it beneath his sleeve. "I have about 15 more minutes before Lily finishes rehearsal." Charlotte smiled. "Tell me about her favorite song." Ethan's face brightened immediately. "There are too many to count. Last month she decided every Saturday morning should begin with old folk songs because she said they make pancakes taste better." Charlotte laughed so warmly that 2 nearby diners instinctively looked over. "Does it work? Honestly?" Ethan grinned. "I think it does. She sounds remarkable." "She is." His voice softened. "She reminds me every day that hope can sound like a child singing in another room." Charlotte lowered her eyes for a moment, unexpectedly moved by the simplicity of the image. In her world, hope usually arrived through market reports, successful negotiations, or charitable milestones announced from podiums. Ethan found hope in hearing his daughter hum while making breakfast. At the nearby executive table, Richard Collins quietly watched the conversation continue. One of his colleagues leaned closer and whispered, "She has been sitting with him for almost an hour." Richard frowned. "There has to be a reason. Maybe she already knows him." Richard shook his head. "If she did, she would have introduced him." Another executive muttered, "Perhaps he planned this somehow." Their quiet speculation floated no farther than their own table, but Charlotte noticed the repeated glances. She recognized that familiar pattern of assumption. It followed wealth wherever wealth appeared. She looked back toward Ethan, wondering whether he had sensed any of it. He had not. Instead, he was carefully folding the dessert napkin into a neat square before placing it beside the empty plate, exactly the way someone might quietly straighten a room before leaving it. There was something deeply comforting about the habit. He left every place a little more orderly than he had found it. Charlotte finally asked the question that had been quietly growing in her heart all evening. "Ethan, may I ask you something personal?" "Certainly." "After everything life has asked of you, after losing your wife, raising Lily alone, working long days, and still finding reasons to be kind, what keeps you from becoming bitter?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked once more toward the old Navy photograph hanging above the table before speaking in the same calm voice that had carried every conversation that night. "Because Lily is always watching," he said. "Whether she is standing beside me or not, I know one day she will remember how I treated people when nobody expected me to be kind. That memory will teach her far more than anything I could ever say." Charlotte felt something inside her become perfectly still. In all the years she had spent meeting extraordinary people, she had rarely encountered someone whose greatest ambition was simply to leave his daughter an example worth remembering, and in that quiet corner of the restaurant she began to understand that true greatness almost never announced itself. It simply lived with quiet dignity until someone finally chose to see it. The grandfather clock near the entrance chimed softly as Ethan glanced at his watch one final time. Choir rehearsal would be ending soon, and somewhere across town Lily would already be gathering her music folder, probably chatting with her friends before running toward the parking lot with the same bright smile that made every long workday worthwhile. He reached for his messenger bag and carefully slipped his paperback novel inside beside the container holding tomorrow's steak sandwich. Every movement carried the same quiet precision Charlotte had noticed all evening. Nothing hurried. Nothing careless. "I should probably head out," he said with an apologetic smile. "If I arrive even 2 minutes late, Lily will tell everyone I forgot how clocks work." Charlotte laughed warmly. "Children can be surprisingly dramatic. Only when they know you love them enough to laugh about it." He stood and gently pushed his chair back beneath the table before reaching for the check folder. Mrs. Evelyn appeared almost instantly, carrying it with her familiar smile. "You two solved all the world's problems yet?" Ethan chuckled. "Not quite." Charlotte smiled at the waitress. "But we made a good start." Mrs. Evelyn nodded knowingly before handing the leather folder toward Ethan. Without hesitation, he reached for his wallet. Charlotte quietly extended her hand. "Please allow me." Ethan looked up with genuine appreciation but gently shook his head. "That is very kind, but no. You bought dinner for your daughter tomorrow before buying dessert for yourself," Charlotte replied. "Please let me return a little kindness." Ethan smiled softly, the same calm smile that had never once seemed forced throughout the evening. "You already have." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "How?" "By sharing your time." She stared at him for a brief moment, unsure whether anyone had ever answered her that way before. "Time is valuable," Ethan continued. "You chose to spend yours talking with a stranger. That is more than enough." Charlotte looked down at the check folder resting between them. Money had solved countless problems throughout her life. It had built hospitals, funded scholarships, restored neighborhoods, and supported families through difficult seasons. Yet sitting across from Ethan, she realized there were still moments when offering money felt almost too small. Mrs. Evelyn quietly stepped back, sensing the conversation belonged entirely to them. Ethan placed several carefully counted bills inside the folder, including another generous tip. Charlotte noticed it immediately. "You always tip that much?" Ethan nodded. "Mrs. Evelyn remembers every regular customer's favorite meal, asks about their families, and somehow makes strangers feel welcome within 5 minutes." He smiled toward the elderly waitress. "People like that deserve appreciation." Mrs. Evelyn pretended not to hear, although the corners of her eyes glistened slightly beneath the warm dining room lights. Charlotte lowered her gaze for a moment. Once again, Ethan had noticed someone most people quietly overlooked. As they walked together toward the entrance, conversations briefly softened around them. Several guests looked up from their meals, still trying to understand the unusual friendship that had quietly formed over apple pie and coffee. Richard Collins watched from across the room, unable to hide his curiosity. He expected Ethan to linger, perhaps ask for a business card, perhaps suggest another meeting. Instead, Ethan simply stopped beside the front door and turned toward Charlotte with the same relaxed courtesy he had shown since they first met. "Thank you for inviting me to share dessert," he said sincerely. "It made an ordinary Thursday unexpectedly memorable." Charlotte smiled. "I was about to say the same thing." A cool evening breeze drifted through the entrance as someone stepped outside onto the harbor sidewalk. The distant sound of water touching wooden docks filled the brief silence between them. Charlotte reached into her handbag and removed a simple cream-colored business card. There were no elaborate designs, only her name and a telephone number printed in understated lettering. "If you ever feel like continuing this conversation," she said gently, "I would enjoy hearing more about Lily's choir concerts and those Saturday pancake mornings." Ethan accepted the card politely without studying it. He slipped it into the front pocket of his messenger bag beside his notebook as naturally as someone accepting directions from a new acquaintance. "Thank you, Charlotte." He smiled warmly. Perhaps one day. There was no excitement at receiving the card. No attempt to discover what opportunities it might contain. To Ethan it represented exactly what she had offered. Another conversation. Nothing more. Charlotte found that strangely comforting. "Drive safely," she said. "And tell Lily I hope tomorrow's sandwich tastes even better than tonight's dinner." Ethan laughed. "I will." He tipped his head in a quiet gesture of respect before stepping out into the crisp Maryland evening. Charlotte remained just inside the entrance, watching as he crossed the parking lot beneath rows of softly glowing lamps. He unlocked an older blue pickup truck that had clearly been cared for with patience rather than money. Before climbing inside, he paused for a moment to look toward the marina where moonlight shimmered across the Chesapeake Bay. Then he quietly drove away without ever looking back. Charlotte stood motionless, listening as the sound of the truck gradually faded into the distance. Around her, the restaurant slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, but nothing inside her felt ordinary anymore. For reasons she could not fully explain, the quiet father who had walked away carrying leftovers for his daughter had also carried away something she had not realized she had been searching for all these years. The simple reminder that the most valuable people in life are often the ones who never try to convince anyone of their worth. Charlotte Bennett remained standing near the restaurant entrance for several moments after Ethan's pickup disappeared beyond the curve of the Marina Road. The cool night air drifted through the open doorway carrying the scent of salt water and distant pine, but her thoughts remained fixed on the quiet conversation that had somehow changed the entire direction of her evening. She had attended international summits, state dinners, and charity galas attended by some of the most influential people in the world, yet a simple slice of apple pie shared with a humble father had stayed with her more deeply than any carefully planned event in recent memory. On the drive home, the city lights reflected across her windshield while familiar streets passed almost unnoticed. Instead of reviewing tomorrow's meetings in her mind as she usually did, she found herself replaying Ethan's words. "Peace is usually quieter than winning an argument. Gratitude stays. Hope can sound like a child singing in another room." None of those sentences had been rehearsed. None had been offered to impress her. They were simply the natural language of someone who had quietly built his life around character instead of recognition. When Charlotte arrived home, the large waterfront estate overlooking the Severn River felt unusually silent. The house was beautiful, carefully designed, and filled with remarkable artwork collected over many years, yet tonight its polished halls seemed strangely empty. She placed her handbag on the kitchen island, poured herself a cup of tea instead of the usual evening coffee, and sat beside the wide living room windows overlooking the dark water. Her assistant had already sent tomorrow's schedule, filled from early morning until evening with board meetings, interviews, and foundation planning sessions. Charlotte closed the calendar without reading it. There was something she wanted to understand first. The following morning, just after sunrise, Charlotte arrived at Bennett Global Ventures earlier than anyone expected. The executive offices overlooked downtown Baltimore through floor-to-ceiling windows glowing with soft, golden light. Her longtime chief of staff, Margaret Collins, entered carrying a folder of briefing materials before noticing Charlotte standing quietly beside the glass. "You are here early," Margaret observed. Charlotte smiled faintly. "I met someone yesterday." Margaret raised an eyebrow with gentle curiosity. "Someone important?" Charlotte looked toward the waking city below. "Very." She hesitated before adding, "Although I do not think he would ever describe himself that way." Margaret had worked beside Charlotte for nearly 15 years. She recognized the thoughtful expression immediately. "Would you like me to learn more about him?" Charlotte remained silent for a moment before nodding once. "His name is Ethan Walker. He repairs boats at one of the marinas near Annapolis. He served in the Navy years ago. He is raising a 9-year-old daughter named Lily." Margaret quietly wrote the information into her notebook without asking unnecessary questions. She understood that Charlotte valued discretion above all else. "Nothing intrusive," Charlotte added gently. "I simply want to know whether the man I met last night lives the way he speaks." "Of course," Margaret replied. "I will be careful." By late afternoon, Margaret returned carrying only a thin folder. Charlotte immediately noticed its size. Most background reports involving people connected to her business world arrived several inches thick. This one contained only a handful of pages. Margaret placed it carefully on the desk. "There is not very much to find," she explained, "which may be the most remarkable part." Charlotte opened the folder slowly. The first page confirmed Ethan's military service in the United States Navy, followed by an honorable discharge after completing his commitment. There were no scandals, no lawsuits, no financial disputes, no public controversies. The next page described his employment at a family-owned marina where he had worked steadily for several years repairing fishing boats, sailboats, and small commercial vessels. Another page listed volunteer hours mentoring teenagers interested in marine mechanics on Saturday mornings twice each month. Charlotte continued reading quietly. After his wife Emily passed away several years earlier, neighbors had organized meals for Ethan and Lily during the first difficult weeks. According to every interview Margaret had conducted that afternoon, Ethan later repaid every act of kindness without announcing it. He quietly repaired an elderly widow's boat engine without charging her. He shoveled snow from several driveways every winter before sunrise. He anonymously paid school lunch balances whenever he learned another child had fallen behind. No one interviewed could remember Ethan speaking about those things. They only remembered discovering them afterward. Charlotte closed the folder gently and looked out across the skyline once again. "So it was all true?" she whispered. Margaret nodded. "Actually, there is one more thing." She slid a handwritten note across the desk. "His supervisor said that whenever someone thanks Ethan for helping, he always gives the same answer." Charlotte unfolded the paper and read the single sentence written across the page. "Someone once helped me when I needed it most. I am simply keeping kindness moving." Charlotte read the words twice before carefully folding the note again. A quiet smile appeared, followed by something even rarer, a feeling that destiny had perhaps arranged an ordinary Thursday evening far more carefully than either of them had realized. Somewhere across Maryland, Ethan Walker was almost certainly repairing another weathered boat beneath the morning sun, completely unaware that the woman he believed to be an ordinary dinner companion had just discovered that the quiet dignity she admired over apple pie was not an exception in his life. It was the way he chose to live every single day. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Charlotte Bennett reached for the cream-colored business card holder on her desk and realized that she was still thinking about a quiet father who repaired boats, instead of the dozen influential people she had met since that Thursday evening. Every morning brought new meetings, charitable initiatives, and investment decisions affecting thousands of employees, yet whenever her schedule finally grew quiet, her thoughts drifted back to a small corner table overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, warm apple pie, and a conversation that had asked nothing from her except honesty. She finally made a decision. "Margaret," she said as her chief of staff entered the office carrying another stack of briefing folders. "What community events are we supporting this weekend?" Margaret checked her tablet. "There is the annual Chesapeake Harbor Family Festival in Annapolis on Saturday. Bennett Foundation is sponsoring the scholarship program for local children." Charlotte smiled thoughtfully. Perfect. Saturday arrived wrapped in bright autumn sunshine. Families filled the waterfront park with picnic blankets, laughter, and the cheerful sounds of children racing between booths selling homemade crafts, local seafood, and fresh apple cider. Small sailboats drifted lazily across the sparkling bay while a community choir rehearsed patriotic songs on the main stage. It was the kind of event where no one hurried because everyone had already arrived exactly where they wanted to be. Charlotte chose simple blue jeans, a light cream sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. Without the formal business attire that usually surrounded her public appearances, she blended easily into the weekend crowd. She wanted another ordinary conversation, not another carefully managed introduction. Across the festival grounds, Ethan Walker tightened the final bolt on a portable wooden display built by volunteers from the marina before stepping back with quiet satisfaction. The booth featured handcrafted toy sailboats that local mechanics had built with children during free Saturday workshops. Every dollar raised would purchase musical instruments for elementary schools throughout Anne Arundel County. Beside him, Lily carefully arranged painted wooden boats across the table while humming softly to herself. Her long blonde hair danced in the harbor breeze as she worked with complete concentration. "Daddy," she said, holding up a bright blue sailboat decorated with tiny white stars. "Do you think somebody will love this one?" Ethan smiled warmly. "I think somebody already should." Lily grinned. "Then we have to find them." Charlotte noticed them almost immediately after entering the festival. Ethan looked exactly as she remembered, calm, approachable, quietly focused on helping everyone around him before thinking about himself. But this time she also saw Lily. The little girl laughed as she helped a younger child choose between two painted sailboats, patiently explaining which colors reminded her of summer sunsets over the bay. Charlotte stood still for a moment, simply watching the scene unfold. Everything Ethan had shared about his daughter during dinner had been true. Hope really did sound like a child singing in another room. Before Charlotte could decide whether to approach them, Lily looked up and recognized her first. Her eyes brightened instantly. She tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve. "Daddy, I think your apple pie friend is here." Ethan turned, surprised for only a second before a genuine smile crossed his face. "Charlotte." She walked toward them with the same easy warmth she had shown at the restaurant. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all," Ethan replied. "Although I believe someone deserves a proper introduction." He looked toward his daughter. "Lily, this is Charlotte. We shared dessert a couple of Thursdays ago." Lily smiled brightly and offered her small hand with perfect manners. "It is nice to meet you. Daddy said you like apple pie." Charlotte laughed softly while shaking her hand. "Your father remembered the important part." Lily looked proudly toward Ethan. "He remembers everything." Charlotte noticed the quiet affection in the little girl's voice. It was not admiration built on grand gestures or expensive gifts. It came from hundreds of ordinary moments that had quietly become extraordinary through consistency. Ethan looked around the busy festival before asking, "What brings you here?" Charlotte answered honestly. "The foundation supports the Children's Scholarship Program." Ethan nodded. "Then thank you." "For what?" "For believing children deserve opportunities." His gratitude sounded exactly like it had at the restaurant, sincere, uncomplicated, and entirely free from assumptions about recognition. Charlotte smiled. I was actually hoping to spend the afternoon walking through the festival. Lily's face brightened. Would you like to see our boats first? I would love to. The little girl eagerly began describing each handcrafted sailboat, explaining which children had painted them and what every color represented. Ethan quietly stepped aside, watching the conversation unfold with gentle pride. Charlotte realized that Lily carried the same kindness her father practiced every day. She welcomed strangers as though they had always belonged. Nearby, festival volunteers greeted Charlotte politely without drawing attention to her presence. To most people, she was simply another visitor enjoying a beautiful Saturday along the Chesapeake Bay. Ethan never introduced her by title. Lily never asked about her career. They simply invited her into their afternoon as naturally as though another place had always been waiting beside them. As the harbor breeze carried laughter across the waterfront and children chased colorful kites beneath a bright blue Maryland sky, Charlotte quietly understood that she had finally found the one thing no amount of success had ever guaranteed: a place where she was welcomed not because of what she had accomplished, but simply because she had shown up with an open heart. The afternoon sunlight settled gently across the Chesapeake Harbor Family Festival, painting the water in shades of gold while families wandered from booth to booth carrying cups of warm cider and bags filled with handmade treasures. Children laughed as colorful kites danced above the shoreline, musicians tuned guitars near the main stage, and a steady breeze carried the comforting scent of fresh popcorn and salt air across the park. Charlotte had not looked at her phone in nearly 2 hours, something that had not happened on a Saturday in longer than she could remember. Instead, she found herself sitting beside Ethan and Lily on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the marina while Lily happily explained the names she had given each painted sailboat. This one is called Hope, Lily announced proudly, lifting a blue boat decorated with tiny white stars. Because Daddy says hope keeps moving even when you cannot see the wind. Charlotte smiled warmly. Your father says many beautiful things. Lily grinned. He does not know they are beautiful. He just says them. Ethan laughed softly and rubbed the back of his neck with quiet embarrassment. Now you are both making me sound much wiser than I really am. No, Charlotte replied gently. You simply notice things that many people forget. Before Ethan could answer, one of the festival coordinators hurried toward them carrying a clipboard. Mr. Walker, she called with a cheerful smile. The scholarship committee wants to thank all of the volunteers on stage before the choir performs. Ethan immediately shook his head. Please thank everyone else. I am happy staying here. But you built half the display booths, she protested. Along with many other volunteers, Ethan answered kindly. Recognition belongs to all of us or none of us. The coordinator smiled knowingly. I thought you might say that. She walked away without arguing further. Charlotte watched the brief exchange with thoughtful eyes. You never seem comfortable being recognized. Ethan looked toward the children running across the grass. Recognition is pleasant, but it is not why most worthwhile things should be done. Charlotte remained quiet for a moment before speaking carefully. Ethan, may I ask you something that has been on my mind since we met? Of course. Have you ever considered expanding your marina business? Ethan smiled. Not really. You are obviously talented. You mentor young people, restore boats, organize community projects. With the right resources, you could build something much larger. Ethan listened respectfully before answering. Perhaps. Charlotte hesitated, choosing her words with care. If someone believed in your work and wanted to invest, would you accept the opportunity? Ethan understood the question immediately, although he did not yet understand why she was asking it. He smiled with genuine gratitude. That is generous to even consider. Charlotte waited quietly. Ethan looked out across the harbor where several small sailboats drifted peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. When Emily became sick, he began softly. Friends, neighbors, and complete strangers helped us through the hardest season of our lives. Some gave money. Some brought meals. Some simply sat beside us when silence was all we needed. I promised myself that if life ever became steady again, I would spend the rest of my years quietly passing those gifts forward. Charlotte nodded, listening closely. And that is exactly what you are doing. I try. He smiled. But I do not need a larger company to keep that promise. Charlotte studied him with admiration. What if the investment could make life easier for you and Lily? Ethan's expression remained warm, but there was quiet certainty behind his eyes. Life is already rich. Charlotte looked surprised. Ethan continued gently. We have a safe home. Lily has food on the table, books to read, music to sing, and people who love her. We laugh every day. I have work that I enjoy. If more opportunities come someday, I will welcome them with gratitude. But I do not want to spend so much time building a bigger business that I accidentally miss the years my daughter is still asking me to watch every choir rehearsal. Charlotte lowered her eyes. His words carried no criticism toward ambition, only clarity about his own priorities. You really mean that? She whispered. Ethan nodded. Children only grow up once. A comfortable silence settled between them as waves lapped gently against the marina docks. Lily skipped over carrying 2 cups of fresh lemonade, handing one to Charlotte with a bright smile. Daddy says taking breaks makes people kinder. Charlotte accepted the drink with a grateful laugh. Your father has a lesson for everything. Lily nodded proudly. He says lessons are easier to remember when they happen during ordinary days. Charlotte looked from the little girl to the quiet father beside her, and suddenly understood why every person she had spoken with during her background inquiries described Ethan the same way. His kindness was not occasional. It was simply the natural shape of his life. She had met brilliant executives, celebrated innovators, decorated military leaders, and extraordinary philanthropists, yet none of them had ever made success sound as simple as protecting time with the people you love. As the children's choir gathered near the stage, and the first gentle notes of music floated across the harbor, Charlotte realized that the greatest wealth she had encountered all year was sitting quietly beside her on an old wooden bench, completely unaware that he possessed something money could never purchase, and something she had quietly been searching for all along. The children's choir gathered beneath the white pavilion overlooking the Chesapeake Bay as families slowly filled rows of folding chairs arranged across the gently sloping lawn. The late afternoon sun rested low above the water, bathing everything in warm amber light, while a cool breeze carried the scent of salt, pine, and freshly cut grass across the harbor. Parents lifted phones to capture memories, grandparents settled into comfortable conversations, and volunteers quietly folded empty tables after another successful community festival. Ethan and Charlotte found seats near the back, giving Lily an enthusiastic wave as she joined the other children on stage. She smiled brightly before taking her place in the front row, her small blue ribbon fluttering softly in the wind. The first notes of the choir floated across the marina, gentle and hopeful, blending naturally with the rhythmic sound of waves brushing against wooden docks. Charlotte listened with quiet admiration, while Ethan watched only one face among dozens. Every time Lily sang, his expression softened in the same way Charlotte had noticed whenever he spoke about his daughter. It was not pride rooted in achievement. It was gratitude rooted in love. When the final song ended, applause rolled across the park like a warm tide. Children hurried toward waiting families, filling the air with laughter and excited voices. Lily ran straight into Ethan's arms before turning to Charlotte with an enormous smile. Did you like it? She asked eagerly. Very much, Charlotte answered honestly. You sang with your whole heart. Lily beamed. Daddy says people remember feelings longer than perfect notes. Charlotte looked at Ethan with an amused smile. Another lesson? Ethan shrugged playfully. I may have said something like that. As they began walking slowly along the harbor path, the festival gradually settled into its quiet evening rhythm. Booths closed one by one while volunteers stacked chairs and families carried sleepy children toward waiting cars. The sky shifted from gold to soft shades of lavender, reflecting across the calm Chesapeake water like a watercolor painting. Charlotte slowed her pace. There was something she had wanted to say since the evening they first met, and somehow this peaceful shoreline felt like the right place. Ethan, she said gently, He looked toward her with the same calm attention he always offered. "There is something I should tell you." He smiled. "All right." Charlotte folded her hands together for a brief moment before speaking. "The night we met at Harbor House was not entirely an accident." Ethan listened quietly without interruption. "When I walked into the restaurant, nearly everyone looked at me except one person." She smiled softly. "You." Ethan looked slightly surprised but remained silent. "Then I watched you do something almost no one else noticed. Before your dinner arrived, an older veteran sitting alone near the entrance accidentally dropped his dinner roll. You quietly asked the waiter to bring him another basket without saying who paid for it. A few minutes later you folded half your own meal into a container for Lily. Then you gave a paper sailboat to a frightened little boy without waiting for his parents to thank you." Ethan blinked, trying to remember the small moments she described. "I realized something," Charlotte continued. "You treated every person in that room with exactly the same respect, whether they could give you something in return or not. That is why I walked to your table." Ethan looked down at the harbor path beneath his feet before smiling almost sheepishly. "I honestly forgot about the dinner roll." Charlotte laughed softly. "I know you did. It was not important." She stopped walking and turned toward him. "It was to me." The breeze gently stirred the leaves above them as evening settled across the waterfront. Charlotte's voice grew quieter. "I have spent much of my life wondering whether people saw me or simply saw my success. That night, before we ever spoke, I realized you had not looked at me once. You were too busy noticing everyone else." Ethan stood thoughtfully for a long moment before answering. "Emily used to tell me that the smallest kindness is often the easiest one to overlook. She believed those were the ones that mattered most because nobody expected them." Charlotte felt her eyes grow unexpectedly warm. "She must have been an extraordinary woman." Ethan smiled toward the fading sunset. "She still teaches Lily and me every day." After a comfortable silence, Charlotte took a slow breath. "There is one more thing I should finally tell you." Ethan looked at her patiently. "My full name is Charlotte Bennett." He smiled politely. "I remember." She laughed quietly. "No, I mean Charlotte Bennett of Bennett Global Ventures." Ethan stopped walking. For the first time since they had met, genuine surprise crossed his face. He searched her expression, then slowly connected the name to the countless newspaper headlines and magazine covers he had occasionally noticed without paying much attention. Before he could say a word, Charlotte continued with a gentle smile. "I wanted you to know because I no longer wanted there to be anything hidden between us." Ethan remained silent for another moment before a warm smile gradually returned to his face. "Then I suppose," he said softly, "I am very glad I invited the right person to share apple pie, even if I did not know who she was." Charlotte smiled through quiet emotion, realizing that even after learning the truth, the first thing Ethan valued was still not her fortune, her influence, or her reputation. It was simply the conversation they had shared, and in that peaceful moment beside the Chesapeake Bay, she knew with complete certainty that she had finally met someone whose respect had never depended on knowing her name. The weeks that followed unfolded with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, yet somehow nothing felt quite ordinary anymore. Thursday evenings became an unspoken tradition once again at Harbor House Steak and Grill, where Mrs. Evelyn always smiled before anyone reached the table because she already knew exactly what would happen. Ethan still ordered the same steak. He still packed half of it away for Lily's school lunch. Charlotte still insisted on ordering 2 slices of apple pie. The only difference was that the empty chair across from Ethan no longer stayed empty. Outside the restaurant windows, the Chesapeake Bay continued reflecting the changing seasons while sailboats drifted across calm water exactly as they always had. Inside, conversations grew warmer, laughter came more easily, and what had begun as one unexpected dinner slowly became a friendship built not on grand promises but on countless ordinary moments shared with honesty. Charlotte soon discovered that Lily had inherited her father's gift for making people feel welcome. Every Saturday morning, the 3 of them met at the marina before the volunteer workshops began. While Ethan patiently taught children how to sand wooden hulls or tie simple sailing knots, Lily happily painted tiny boats beside the dock, and Charlotte quietly joined them without worrying whether anyone recognized her. Some people eventually did. They whispered politely, surprised to see one of the country's most successful business leaders sitting on an overturned bucket helping children paint little blue stars on toy sailboats. Charlotte no longer felt the need to explain herself. She had finally found a place where titles disappeared beneath shared purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, Bennett Global Ventures announced a new national education initiative supporting music programs and vocational training for coastal communities. Reporters immediately praised Charlotte's leadership, assuming the idea had emerged from months of corporate planning. Only Margaret knew the truth. The inspiration had begun with a little girl singing beside the Chesapeake Bay and a quiet father who believed every child deserved the chance to discover hope through ordinary opportunities. Charlotte never mentioned Ethan's name during interviews because she understood something he had taught her. The purest kindness does not ask for recognition. Several months later, Harbor House celebrated its 50th anniversary. Mrs. Evelyn planned to retire at the end of the year, and the restaurant organized a small gathering to honor her decades of service. Former employees returned from across Maryland. Families she had watched grow through generations filled the dining room with flowers, handwritten letters, and grateful memories. Ethan arrived early with Lily, carrying a carefully restored wooden rocking chair he had refinished during evenings at the marina after work. Charlotte arrived a few minutes later with a framed collection of photographs gathered from longtime customers whose lives Mrs. Evelyn had quietly touched through simple conversations and faithful service. When the celebration ended, Mrs. Evelyn wiped tears from her eyes before looking at Ethan and Charlotte standing beside one another. She smiled knowingly. "I spent 40 years serving meals," she said softly. "Every now and then life lets you witness something even more satisfying than good food." Ethan chuckled gently. "Like what?" She looked toward Lily, who was laughing while showing another child how to fold paper sailboats. "Watching good hearts find each other." Time continued moving forward as it always does. Lily grew taller. Her choir performances became more confident. Ethan remained at the marina because he still believed repairing honest work for honest people was enough. Charlotte continued leading her company with the same determination that had built it from the beginning, but those closest to her noticed something had changed. Board meetings became shorter. Family foundations received more of her personal time than corporate receptions. She smiled more often, listened longer, and no longer measured success only by numbers printed inside annual reports. One spring evening, nearly a year after the dinner that had quietly changed everything, the three of them returned to the same corner table beneath the old Navy photograph. Mrs. Evelyn had officially retired, but she stopped by that evening as a guest, smiling as another waitress served steak, apple pie, and fresh coffee exactly the way tradition required. Ethan looked around the familiar room before quietly saying, "Funny how one ordinary dinner can change an entire year." Charlotte smiled. "Perhaps it was never ordinary." Lily reached into her backpack and placed a carefully folded paper sailboat in the center of the table. Across its tiny white sail she had written one simple sentence in blue ink. "Kindness always finds its way home." Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet pride while Charlotte gently touched the little paper boat, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within her heart. Outside, the evening sun slowly disappeared. Beyond the Chesapeake Bay, painting the water with gold before giving way to peaceful twilight. Inside, no one hurried to leave. There were no speeches left to make, no fortunes left to discuss, no titles needing recognition. There was only gratitude, quiet laughter, and three people sharing another simple meal. Sometimes the greatest miracles never arrive with flashing lights or extraordinary headlines. Sometimes they begin with one empty chair, one unexpected invitation, one conversation offered without judgment, and one person who chooses dignity over attention. Because in the end, the rarest fortune is never measured by what we own. It is measured by the hearts that remain beside us long after the dinner plates have been cleared away.